All creatures are capable of communicating in ways vital to their survival. They can signal an array of perceptions and emotions. Hunger, danger, the drive to reproduce. Some animals communicate so clearly that we could almost label their calls words. In Africa, for instance, vervet monkeys use 3 separate sounds to broadcast different kinds of danger. When a young vervet hears the snake call, he looks around. When he hears the leopard call, he climbs high into the trees. And when he hears the eagle call, he scampers for cover. The calls have specific meanings that can't be confused if the animal is to survive. But do animals which produce calls like these have language? At what point does animal communication leave off and human language begin?
Speak. Louder.
Finding that point scientifically has not been easy. Early researchers thought one way was to train animals to act like us.
Do this, Vicky. Do this.
Stringing words together logically implies that language exists. And if an animal were to actually use those words naturally, the implication would be even stronger. Jane Goodall has been considering the issue for 3 decades. She's looked for clues in chimpanzees' spontaneous behaviors.
There's a very poignant story about a female chimpanzee called Lucy. She was raised from infancy in a human home, treated just like one of the family. She went to the refrigerator, took out cold snacks, poured herself a drink, watched the television, had access to magazines, her own bedroom, everything. And when she was somewhere between 10 and 13, for some reason her parents decided to send her back to Africa. She'd never seen another chimp. And I believe it was rather like sending a somewhat pampered Western adolescent out to live with some Australian Aborigines, for example, by herself. And she arrived in the Gambia. She was put in a large field enclosure with a couple of rather boisterous wild-born chimps from Burundi. And she went into deep depression, which lasted for at least 2 years, trying to avoid the approaches of these 2 creatures who she didn't know at all. And just around this time, she was visited by someone who had known her in the old days when she was part of a family. At that time, Lucy had been taught, I don't know, somewhere between 60 and 100 signs of the American Sign Language. And when she saw this visitor, she ran over to the wire of her enclosure, and she looked into her eyes, and she said, "Please help, out."
In her desperation, Lucy was capable of using what she'd been taught. But Goodall doesn't consider this evidence at all conclusive. The question remains, how far does this primitive potential for language extend? David Premack.
One way of shedding some light on what is language would be to attempt to teach it to a non-human species. In my own case, the reason for doing so was to explore the nature of the difference, of the alleged difference between our species and other species, and of course in some measure to understand the nature of language.
Premack is a pioneer in research into animal communication.
Good boy.
He's been trying to train animals to communicate with a language of plastic symbols, a system he developed some 30 years ago.
Sit up, Whiskey. Come on. Good boy. Okay? Pay attention. All right? See that?
I designed a very simple language for the chimp, which didn't require that it have the basic machinery of human language. It simply required that the animal be able to learn rules.
Okay. Good boy.
Training always begins by attempting to name various items in the world. Take a piece of plastic out, and you take an object out, and you attempt to develop an association between the two.
Okay, wait. Okay. See this word? Which one goes with this word? Chow. Good boy. Very good.
See, the interesting thing about learning words in the chimp, in fact, is that essentially all chimp words are learned in that fashion by directly associating the word with some object. The main deficiency in the chimpanzee is there is no evidence that it has any grammatical competence, that it has notions like subject, noun phrase, verb phrase, without which you cannot formulate the rules of human language.
Well, if I'm asked what the difference is, the real crucial difference between chimpanzees and humans, I would say without doubt from my own perspective that it's because humans have developed a spoken language. Chimpanzees can be taught certain types of languages in the labs, and they can learn signs and symbols and string them together and communicate meaningfully, but they haven't developed their own spoken language. And this frees humans from the present. It enables us to discuss the past and learn from it. It enables us to make meaningful plans not only for the immediate future, which even a chimp can do, but for next year or in 10 years' time. It enables us to pass on traditions and cultures to our children about types of behavior or objects which are not present, because we can talk about them, we can explain them. And in this way, we are completely and utterly different from the chimpanzees, and always shall be, I believe.
But are the rules of human language the ultimate criterion by which we judge whether animal communication can be called language? Other investigators challenge this assumption. At Central Washington University, Roger and Debbie Fouts have been studying animal communication with some star pupils, chimpanzees who have been taught American Sign Language.
Well, the early research that started with cross-fostering, or humans raising chimpanzees as if they were children, focused on the early years. Kellogg and Kellogg raised a chimp by the name of Gua in their home for about 9 months, along with their son Donald. And then, of course, there's the Hayes' very famous research in the late 40s and 50s, where they raised a chimpanzee by the name of Vicky for 6 years, attempting to teach her vocal speech. Those were failures. And then the Gardner's Project, the one that this is a continuation of, Washoe was raised as if she were a deaf human child. And that was begun in 1966, and then in 1970 we took over Project Washoe from the Gardners and went with Washoe to the University of Oklahoma. And from that point on, we've been expanding it beyond the early developmental linguistic aspects and looking at really how these chimpanzees as adults and in a social group use their sign language and primarily among each other, as well as us as well. We still look at their conversations with humans, certainly in various research projects. But one of our primary interests and focus has been how do they use it amongst themselves.
Without any humans present, we videotaped the chimpanzees during the day for 20-minute segments for 15 consecutive days, and we found that they signed to each other, they signed to themselves, they signed about magazines, they rarely asked. They never asked for food, and they very rarely discussed food. They would only discuss food occasionally, the way we would perhaps say, I think it's time for a little cheesecake. Actually, what happened, Tatu sat next to Washoe, and Washoe said it was time for blankets. And Tatu looked at her and signed, "Time berry." Perhaps it wasn't quite blanket time as far as Tatu was concerned. And I think the exciting thing for us was it opened up a whole new area for us with the remote videotape. We took the human element with data collection completely out for that period of time, and we looked at a whole lot of other interesting imaginary signing, private signing, various areas as part of as an offshoot of the remote video recording.
One of the interesting things that come out of Debbie's research for the remote video recording was the chimpanzee to chimpanzee use of sign language, and that they used it spontaneously among themselves and in meaningful situations, and for them, in meaningful situations for them. For example, there's one bit of video that you can see that has Washoe grooming Glueless, and he doesn't move correctly, and she demands, she calls him sort of a person sign or a hey you sign. She says, person, person, and then hug, hug, and then hug, 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 come hug, encouraging him to sit still and let her grooming. And so what's nice is you have the sign language being used interpenetrating in a very, very important chimpanzee to chimpanzee social interaction in grooming. And that's without human interference whatsoever. So these chimps, the sign language is definitely a part of their lives. They use it in a very, very natural sense, and in a sense that is useful for them in establishing and maintaining their relationships. If you look at where we've been headed with primate language in terms of we're by no means at the end of the curve. In fact, if you limited the study of a human communication system to just this very short past 30 years with just a handful of scientists, you would not begin to scratch the surface. I think we're in essence at the same place. I know here in our research, people are looking at conversation repair, how the chimpanzees repair their conversation. They're looking at semantic range, how they use that, and so on and so on. But what's really exciting to us, where we are beginning to move, is beyond the sign language in particular, and looking at dialect in communication, communicative gestures that are different dialects. What they've observed in the wild, McGrew and Tootin, for example, observed that the chimps at Gombe Stream, when they want to be groomed, they raise one arm. The chimps at Mahale Mountains, just 90 kilometers away, will use two hands to mean the same thing. One of the things that's coming out of the dialect and what's coming out of Africa now that's very, very exciting is that chimpanzees, not only do they have dialect and communication, but the tools they use apparently are culturally derived. Some chimpanzee communities have a hammer and anvil technology. Others use termite fishing for tools. The Badongo Forest chimps, Vernon Reynolds has yet to observe any tool use whatsoever. So what we're finding is that they are much like our ancestors and some of the present small society, subsistence society peoples around the world today, and that they really are a people. They have a culture, and one of the aspects of the culture that we're interested in is the communication. And that's very, very exciting, I think, to find out that not only are we not unique with regard to language, but also culture is also the notion that culture is unique to our species is going the same way that language was thought to be unique and so on. In other words, it was never there. They were using absence of evidence and human arrogance to speculate about these things.
Whether animals possess language in human terms or simply a high order of communication is a question that remains open to interpretation and debate. Investigators do agree, however, that the animal mind is capable of a wide range of cognitive expression.